Thank you. All right, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you very much for joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the second session of our 6th Lemkin reunion here at Central European University School of Public Policy. My name is Kirsten Lyer. I'm the acting director of the Shattuck Center for Conflict Negotiation and Recovery. Each year, the Shattuck Center hosts the Lemkin Reunion, a gathering established in 2014 with the generous support of an anonymous donor. The reunion is, of course, named in honor of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish lawyer who, having lost most of his family in the Holocaust, coined the term genocide and then campaigned tirelessly throughout his life to have it codified as an international crime. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for today's panel on how transactional foreign policy impacts the prevention of and accountability for atrocities. Our speakers this afternoon are Mariana Goetz, the founder and director of Rights for Peace, Mohammad Abdallah, executive director of the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center, Rumi Akter, a graduate student from here at Central European University, and Ondřej Klimeš, a researcher at the Oriental Institute in the Czech Academy of Sciences. Because world events have unfortunately prevented us from meeting together in person in Budapest, we've divided up this year's conference into 5 sessions across 3 days. And at 4 p.m. Central European time after this panel today, we'll have another fantastic panel on transactional foreign policy and democratic backsliding. So leave your YouTube page open and join us for that as well. In yesterday evening's opening keynote session, we were delighted to hear from 3 distinguished speakers on the topic of transactional foreign policy. Professor Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of CEU, spoke to us about the responsibility to protect within the current world order. Professor John Shattuck of the Fletcher Center at Tufts University and the Kennedy School at Harvard, and former president of CEU, and the man for whom this center is named, spoke about the forces of disintegration, but inspired us with his optimism about a democratic renewal due in part to the failure of governance around the COVID crisis and growing social unrest and mass protest in response to systemic racism. And last but not least, Christian Science Monitor journalist Ned Temko, who spoke brilliantly and flagged to all of us that we must read the series in the Christian Science Monitor that has been addressing some of the most pressing issues facing the world today. And he also inspired us with his words on the potential for a return to greater international engagement and cooperation in the face of challenges so great that no one nation can face them alone. So following on from that opening panel, I'm delighted that today's panel is going to discuss a number of different aspects of how transactional foreign policy prevents accountability for atrocities. We've seen across the world in recent years, atrocities in Syria, China, Myanmar, the Philippines, and other parts of the world go unpunished. As a former lawyer myself at the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, I found it particularly difficult to watch the decline in willingness to prosecute undeniable violations of international humanitarian law and gross violations of human rights. At the time that I began working in international criminal law, there was great optimism that the then newly established International Criminal Court would take on the mantle from the ad hoc tribunals and really move forward towards a world that did not tolerate war crimes and atrocities. But sadly, as we've witnessed time and time again, this is not the case. There may be outrage, there may be condemnation, but there is little in the way of action. However, there's always cause for optimism. There is still a large number of people around the world who work tirelessly for accountability for atrocities and redress for victims, and some of them you'll hear from today. There are also important efforts to seek new avenues for accountability, like the cases brought by the Gambia to the ICJ against Myanmar, and the cases against Syrian officials in Germany. People, of course, are still collecting evidence of atrocities, often at great personal risk. There will be further evidence in future proceedings. And people are working with victims every day to help them live with what they have endured. Our panelists today will discuss some of the aspects of how transactional foreign policy impacts accountability in Syria, the plight of the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar, and an often forgotten aspect of atrocities, which is the situation of the victims themselves who live with the scars of war crimes and atrocities for the rest of their lives. So we'll start with Mariana in a moment and then hear from Mohammad, Rumi, and Ondřej. But before I ask Mariana to speak, I'd like to encourage everyone listening to please send us your questions. Under the screen on the YouTube page, you'll see a link to menti.com where we'll collect all of your questions. Our great team here at the Centre, Benjamin Wishorsh and Al-Hakam Shar, who've been central to planning and organising this conference, will moderate the questions and send them over to me to put to our panellists. One note is that unfortunately Mohammad has to leave us at 3 p.m. So if you have any specific questions for him, please send them first. And all of the questions are anonymous, but if you would like to be identified, please do so in the text of the question. So with that, I would like to invite Mariana to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So today our panel is looking at how transactional foreign policy is impacting on prevention and accountability for mass atrocities. And I'll be looking more at the international justice system and the rights of victims. And essentially, I'd like to start with a question. Perhaps I should out myself. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm a human rights lawyer, so I work very much within a different space, perhaps. But my question is really looking at the concept of transactional foreign policy and this sort of deal-based foreign policy that we're seeing, and how different it really is in terms of the impact it's having on accountability from business as usual in the human rights world, really, which implies all the difficulties of getting cases investigated and evidence collected and finding a jurisdiction that is able to deal with those cases. So perhaps, I'm just starting by a first question, which is really trying to unpick some of the issues that we're looking at. Of course, accountability for international crimes is a huge challenge, but is it any different? Is that challenge specifically different in this transactional environment, or is it actually, are the challenges similar to those that we found, since the end of the Cold War that have been there as well? So that's really what I'm trying to pick out, whether we're seeing a difference in that sense and what those differences might be. Perhaps also my focus here is going to be more on the accountability mechanisms, so the justice system as a whole, and maybe there are some distinctions to be made between the legal avenues and the political, diplomatic, and military interventions that look at prevention as a whole. Of course, the international justice mechanism is part of the R2P framework, the framework on the responsibility to protect. And it obviously operates within a real world of politics and diplomacy. Is whether and how the particular deal-based trends impacts on this justice system. So perhaps just a step back, as we know, the end of the Cold War saw some great advances in human rights, the rise of the international justice system being one of them, and also perhaps less well known, that I may touch upon a bit, I hope, is the rise of the rights of victims to a remedy and reparation, and how that has sort of moved on as an independent movement of its own in a way. So first of all, the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia in 1993, for Rwanda in 1994, they were obviously established through a multilateral process by the Security Council. And this was really possible in this climate, post-Cold War climate. I would also say that probably the appetite for the ICC was very much spurred by the ad hoc tribunals, the Rwanda and Yugoslav tribunals, and that model of approaching and actually finally, addressing the accountability side of the Genocide Convention in terms of prevent and punish. So a few years later, we had the Rome Conference, 22 years ago now, 1998. I was actually there at the Rome Conference. I was a young legal assistant on the delegation of Senegal at the time. And I remember very much one of the human rights and civil society organizations there, one of the people there, at one of our civil society NGO sort of strategy meetings, came out with a very acute and accurate, I would say, analysis of the situation. He said, we have a window of opportunity here between now and whatever comes next. This is our window of opportunity to get this court established. And if we miss that opportunity, we will never have it again. So that was very interesting for me. I was young at the time and, kind of grew up with the end of the Cold War, in a sense, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And hadn't experienced the Cold War myself, so imagining what would come next and what that might look like was quite an interesting concept. But we all felt the urgency of having that statute adopted that summer in Rome, because of that sense of a window being uniquely open. So the heyday of the International Tribunal saw other hybrid and international institutions created. We had the UNITET, the Transitional Authority in East Timor, the special chambers in the administration in Kosovo of the UN, Special Court for Sierra Leone, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, etc. So there were, during this period, there were a number of other courts and tribunals. But what I'm hoping to try and sort of pick out is how US exceptionalism was already very stark and present at this time. The US was vehemently against the ICC, did everything to wreck its adoption at the Rome Conference by imposing cuts in aid to countries that it was funding. I was representing Senegal. Senegal had to abstain from the final vote due to threats to have aid withdrawn, etc. So this is nothing new. In fact, all the P5 members, all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council had serious issues with the Rome statute and the idea of an independent prosecutor. And only the US, the UK and France really joined the like-minded group really at the 11th hour. But they also were not keen on an independent system. So again, this idea of picking and choosing justice like the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals was very much still at the fore at that time. So that's perhaps something, yeah, just to keep in mind. Just turning a little bit to the rights of victims. At the same time, and perhaps less well known, there were a number of advances made and some important normative shifts happened during this period of this open window period, as I'm calling it. And we saw an important development, which was sort of simultaneous with the drafting of the Rome Statute in terms of the rights of victims to a remedy and reparation. So these were kind of pulled together in a UN General Assembly resolution, the UN Basic Principles on Victims' Rights to a Remedy and Reparation, 2005, and very much are embodied in the Rome Statute on the ICC, which really take the rights of victims a lot further. And initially at the Rome Conference and before the Rome Conference, the rights of victims were really just seen as a complete pipe dream. Then they became an annoyance. And now I would say that they're pretty much accepted as a moral obligation. And they're nearly always mentioned. You will not have conferences discussing international justice that don't mention victims nowadays. But that wasn't the case 20 years ago. So it was very much about, as in Nuremberg, victims really were not part of the process. They were just, witnesses at best. But in terms of their independent rights to information, to protection, to support, to be represented, to participate, to then receive reparation and have an interest in the proceedings as their own, with their own agency is definitely a new thing. So the question is, perhaps also another area that I might mention also is to do with complementarity. That is basically that the ICC has promoted national developments in many countries have been sort of spurred on because of the threat of the ICC investigating these kinds of violations. Now, all these international justice mechanisms all have very big problems of their own, huge challenges of legitimacy of the ICC in Africa, weak investigations, weak evidence, cases that fold, you name it. There have been huge challenges. Now, the question that I'm interested in unpicking really is whether these challenges have an effect and the difficulties have really been hindered further in recent times through this what we're calling this transactional deal-based foreign policy or not. And probably in terms of the way in which the court's failings have unfolded, some of those failings can be attributed to a lack of cooperation with the court, coupled with sort of tribunal fatigue and rising costs. But in a sense, what is really much more worrying is the absence of investigations and institutions where there should be some. So obviously, Syria, in relation to the Rohingya, etc. So where the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction, we are relying on the diplomacy and cooperation through Security Council for referrals, or the creation of new institutions. And here is where we're seeing this kind of impact, where it is a bit of a sort of international justice a la carte. You know, we're happy to support trials in a perhaps even a half-hearted kind of way in locations where there is no threat to national interests, but in locations where there are, we are seeing obviously undermining of the whole system. So if you're a warlord, perhaps in an African country, you might feel that perhaps, you know, today you might think twice about whether you'd be apprehended for war crimes. And this was not the case 22 years ago. But if you're in another part of the world where the ICC has no reach and where there is a Security Council deadlock, then probably you're not particularly concerned. Though maybe you might review your travels to not, travel to a country where universal jurisdiction cases are being brought, etc. But essentially, there is a kind of double standard there. I think I'm going to leave it there and to give a chance to the others, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions and we can cover some other points and issues then. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mariana. That's extremely interesting and very pertinent, I think, to remind us of the hesitation that was there even in Rome in 1998 among those who you would hope were supporting the adoption of the Rome Statute. So thank you very much for that. So we'll move on to Mohammad, and I just want to remind all of our listeners to please post your questions in our Menti. The link is at the bottom of the YouTube page. And with that, we'll cross over to Mohammad. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. And thanks, Mariana, for that presentation. And I want to pick a point and start from it on the ICC itself in relation to Syria, because as we know, Syria is not a state party to the Rome Statute, and that basically we were heavily dependent or over-dependent on a Security Council resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the ICC, which got vetoed by Russia and China 14 times, which is that's 14 times the ICC, but one of the 14 times China and Russia vetoed on Syria was a referral attempt to the ICC for the situation in Syria. But I was in 2012-13, I was on the radio with Ambassador Theodore Kattouf, the former US ambassador to Syria, and somebody called the show and said, "Hey, why your country doesn't go to the ICC? Why there is no ICC referral?" And I told my version of the story. Basically, Syria is not a member state, etc. And then the ambassador said, "No, there's a second half of the story, which nobody knows, but I'm going to tell you on the record now. I was the US ambassador in your country in 2003, and I was assigned by the Bush administration to go to the foreign ministry in Syria and discourage them and threaten them. Dare they join the Rome Statute?" So we ended up being successful in that as the US government, basically threatening a couple of states. Not that the Syrian government was eager to join by its own, but still, when you get a nudge from the United States saying, "Do not join the ICC," that speaks volume about it. I want to take a step back a little bit, because I don't think it's reasonable and fair to discuss Syria in the context of transactional foreign policy without looking regionally at the Middle East, North Africa. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the MENA politics, but just a few highlights. At the beginning, I think inconsistencies of foreign policy has been there a lot. And always foreign policy has been inconsistent. So basically, you get countries ally on one thing in one area, but then they do not apply the same thing in other areas. Now, usually, the usual suspect being victim of this inconsistencies is the issue of human rights. This has been the situation, I don't want to say historically, but more or less in all cases. Basically, countries ally on specific things. When there's terrorism, national security interests, they will ally specifically on those, but then when there's a human rights issue, it's okay to deviate. So if you deviate a little bit, we let you do that, and that's totally fine. Now, if you look at Middle East, North Africa, in my opinion, and I'm glad Mariana brought the US exceptionalism in this, because in my opinion, the US isolationist trend after Iraq and Afghanistan war. So the damage done by Iraq and Afghanistan war to start with, the US is no longer a credible ally on human rights, on justice, and on accountability. That paired with the kind of setback by the Obama administration, we don't want to be the police of the world. We don't want to be following everybody around and try to force here and there. That kind of created a room of, I don't want to call it ambiguity, but it is that. It's basically a room for other new powers to join and to capitalize on this vacuum on the region. So the US withdraw from Middle East, North Africa at large, not militarily, they still have presence in Iraq and they have lots of military bases in the Gulf. But politically, the diplomacy of the US is no longer active in Middle East, North Africa like it was before. That prompted the second tier governments or countries, if I want to call them that, right? Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulfies, the GCC countries at large, to start presenting their interest and fight their own wars directly and publicly. And you see that reflected in lots of places, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, in lots of areas in the region. The military coup in Egypt, so that was funded by the Gulfies against other Gulfies. So the absence of the US, who was instrumental in the foreign policy in general, and the emerge of new powers that wants to occupy some world. And also kind of the US, Russia, and China took another step that we're going to fight from far, from behind. We're going to lead economic wars against each other. We're going to work with sanctions. We're going to do cyber attacks on each other, but intervene and meddle in each other's elections. But we're not going to go to direct confrontation after the Cold War. This is something we agree to. What did that mean for Syria specifically? It meant it is okay to deviate in human rights in general, but it's okay to deviate in anything on the region in Middle East, North Africa. So you get the US strong ally in the region, Turkey, a NATO member, that's actually declining to be with the United States in the war against ISIS, and that the US has to go and arm the Kurdish rebels or militias and work with them inside Syria. Now, of course, the formal line of Turkey is that Turkey is supportive of the US. It's part of the basically de-ISIS or destroying ISIS, the coalition against ISIS. But the terms and the conditions Turkey put on the United States kind of put the United States off, and the US decided to dump a long-term strategic ally and work with its enemy directly inside Syria, arm the Kurds, who Turkey was really crazy about. They don't want to see that happening. In other aspects, this prompted other countries to start not only intervening militarily against their allies in Syria, but also try to undermine those efforts. So you will see Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who both are long-term like allies of the United States and more or less mouthpieces of the United States in the region, working with Russia in some sort, declining to play with the oil and gas prices a little bit to squeeze Russia when the United States wanted that in 2013, 14, 15, because they have their own interest and their own agenda. The issue was re-emphasized and re-established again in this, all that it's okay to deviate. You're not going to pay a price for that. You're no longer our enemy if you vote against us on this one or if you vote against us in that one. Specifically, if the issue is human rights, nobody cares. And this is what made it very difficult for us fighting for justice and accountability for Syria. You will see countries, I don't want to say being called out on specific foreign policy steps or positions, but if the issue is human rights, if it's accountability, kind of nobody cares. You will find a couple of tweets here and there, but not more than that. In very big example, South Africa, when Sudan president, or former president Omar al-Bashir went to South Africa, he's indicted by ICC, he's wanted by ICC, he should be arrested and surrendered to the ICC, extradited to ICC. And it's South Africa, not any country. When South Africa said, we're not going to arrest the guy, we're not going to send him, and there's no consequences for that. When the West tried to call out to South Africa, and South Africa threatened quickly to drop from the ICC, and Russia jumped to encourage 3 countries to drop the ICC because it's targeting African leaders and the same propaganda about the ICC. So the competition between the international powers, Russia, United States, and China, of picking and selecting allies and reorganizing the alliances in Middle East, North Africa, kind of gave lots of margin to those powers to go against their traditional allies. And that kind of inconsistency in the foreign policy that clearly cashed on bad policies related to accountability and to on human rights issues. Definitely there's some red lines where nobody wants to cross, or even the international powers doesn't want really to allow such precedents. For example, terrorism, working with ISIS or try to undermine the coalition against ISIS, will not be looked at favorably. And this is where the US will put its weapons again on the table and say, listen, you know what? Let the Security Council go to other places. We'll do this our own way. We've seen this as well with the use of chemical weapons in Syria, where the United States intervened militarily twice. The Trump administration used military power against the Syrian government twice in response of the use of chemical weapons against people without the Security Council, without permission of the Security Council. In fact, the second time happened, France and UK joined the United States, and they were so happy the US is taking leadership in this and not waiting in the Security Council to act. I remember the session very well. I was watching everything closely. We document what's happening inside the country. And that actually the US and Russia had a heated debate and fight in the council, and they were waiting to vote next morning on the decision on this. And the US went to the military action at night, telling Russia and China directly, we don't care about your veto. We don't care about the Security Council. Definitely, people were happy about this reaction in Syria, and they was like, oh, somebody is standing for this. But this is clearly alarming and dangerous, because the tendency to go out of the Security Council at your own, maybe it happened to be for a good cause this time, to put a red line for the use of chemical weapons, but definitely it was used in the same way in Iraq. If you don't cover us in the Security Council, we're going at our own without a UN coverage to Iraq, you like it or not. So this could repeat a little bit the policies the United States had before, the Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. I want to give two examples where I think major international allies, usually on human rights and accountability, kind of failed us Syrians on the human rights issues and the accountability when it comes to their national security and to the where the cost is a little bit high for them. And definitely foreign policy is pragmatism, right? So you have to get the best for yourself. But we see the issue of refugees being manipulated by Turkey and being used as a card against the EU is very alarming. Every time there is a kind of touch between Turkey and the EU, Turkey start announcing it's going to reopen the borders again, it's going to unleash the refugees to go to Europe, and a refugee flood. Recently, in the very recent example in 2020, when Russia bombed Turkish troops inside Syria, and Turkey was so upset, the US and the EU didn't do much for them, they start threatening to unleash the refugees. And of course, it kind of worked as a blackmailing mechanism as well. Every donor conference, there's recently the Brussels Forum for Syria's Future, where the EU pledged money in big numbers, couple of $1 billion every year, for the host communities around Syria, the countries hosting refugees. And ahead of every conference, there is a statement or two from Turkey about hosting 3 million refugees and how those could cross Europe. Definitely, this is one of the bad examples where we think the EU could have had more principled position or stand on this and not allow Turkey to manipulate the file of refugees. Not that Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq had better policies on this, but still at least not being manipulated in public. The second example, and I'll stop here, was kind of course, all this brings black humor to the table. You see a country like Egypt with a military government where a military coup happened and the international community kind of silenced on it. Nobody spoke about it. Kind of Trump calls President Sisi my favorite dictator. And this has been leaked from different people in the White House and the media. But also see how the foreign policy of those new emerging powers in the region that's benefiting from this conflict between the international powers, the United States, Russia, and China. So you see, Egypt voted in 2016 in two contradicting Security Council resolution related to the conflict in Syria about the bombardment of Aleppo. So Russia proposed a resolution which Egypt voted yes in favor, and France and Spain proposed a resolution that contradicts the Russian resolution, and Egypt voted yes with that one as well. And they had a statement explaining how they voted yes for two contradicting resolutions. I don't want to go to theories more, but I say the re-emerge of the Russian power again back to the international scene, also paired with the alliance with China to some level, and basically the fear of the United States of losing allies to the new blocs or to the new powers or to the re-emerging powers kind of put the international community, the Western liberal democracies at problem here. Like if we kind of proceed with our war in ISIS without Turkey, Russia is going to jump and take advantage of this and sell Turkey the S-400 missiles, and Turkey will be basically an ally of Russia and at the same time ally of NATO, and we don't want to see this happen. So the second tier powers, if I want to call them again, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, even Egypt, and other new emerging powers in the Gulf countries, Qatar and United Arab Emirates, kind of capitalizing in this moment. They do that in Libya, they do that in Yemen, they're doing that in Syria, they did it in Egypt and elsewhere. And now, in a final comment is, you see how those countries are intervening in each other's conflicts without even anybody to tell them to stop. So now the Syrian government is recruiting mercenaries and send them to fight in Libya. And the Turkish government is recruiting mercenaries from the rebels in Syria and send them to fight in Libya. Egypt is intervening militarily in Libya. Clearly, Saudi Arabia and Emirates are funding Egypt to intervene militarily in Libya. The allies in Libya who's fighting next to each other are fighting against each other in Yemen, but it's okay because it's transactional foreign policy. But when you look at this all and see how demands like accountability and human rights, which has not been historically in the top of the agenda, usually is the item dropped or being compromised, that will be suffered the most. And this is what happened in the case of Syria. Sorry, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammad. That's an extremely interesting presentation on transactional foreign policy as it's been impacting Syria. And I particularly found interesting your discussion on the reorganization of allies and the failure of allies. And I think we might come back to that. I'm sure there's going to be some questions coming up about that point. And am I right to think that you have to leave us at 3 o'clock? Yeah, okay. So we might we'll make sure that you get one of the first questions on that. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll move on to Rumi. As I said at the start, Rumi is one of our graduate students from CEU, and I'm delighted to have her here today speaking to us about China and the Rohingya. The floor is yours, Rumi.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'd like to share my screen. Just a moment, please. Can you see my screen? Okay. So, good afternoon. Welcome to my presentation. Today in my presentation, I'll focus on China's transactional foreign policy towards Myanmar's Rakhine state, where predominantly the Rohingya people live. And my presentation will connect China's corporate interest in this ongoing Rohingya crisis. And I'll show that the transactional foreign policy of China is greatly responsible for fueling the Rohingya genocide in the Rakhine state. So this is my presentation outline. First of all, I'll introduce the Rohingya crisis, the context about this, and then I'll talk about China's interest in Myanmar. So there are two pull factors for China to finance Myanmar. These are the natural resources and the geopolitical importance of the Rakhine state. And then I'll show some Chinese companies' investment in Myanmar, in which sectors they are investing. And finally, I'm conclude my presentation. So introduction, this is a picture of a Rohingya woman who just crossed the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar and touches the seashore, as you can see. This picture got the Pulitzer Prize, and it was taken by a journalist of Reuters. So the Rohingyas are known as the most friendless ethnic minority on earth. They have been deprived of fundamental human rights and living in the northern part of Rakhine state in Myanmar, as you can see in the picture. Rakhine state is the western coastal state of Myanmar, and the Rohingya people predominantly live in the northern part of the Rakhine state. And these people are predominantly Muslim people who have been the victim of decade-long persecution by the Myanmar government. And in August 2017, persecution of the Rohingya people started again. And since then, almost 1 million Rohingya people have been living in camps in Bangladesh. However, the international community has been very vocal against these atrocities of the Myanmar government. Even though Myanmar faced condemnation and sanctions from the Western world, it got full support of China. And regarding the United Nations, the UN was hesitating to declare these atrocities as genocide. However, the United Nations Human Rights Council established a fact-finding mission. And after interviewing the victim and witnesses, finally in 2018, after 1 year, they declared these atrocities as genocidal act. So China's interest in Myanmar. The question is, why is China interested in Myanmar? And what makes China follow its transactional policy towards Myanmar? Two factors are crucial to understanding China's approach towards Myanmar. First one is natural resources, and the second one is geopolitical importance of the Rakhine state. These are the two pull factors for China to finance Myanmar. In my presentation, I'll talk about these two factors and relate China's policies towards Myanmar to the Rohingya crisis. Let's talk about the first factor, natural resources. Myanmar is a land full of natural resources. And China is trying to possess these natural resources because the contemporary foreign policy of China is driven by natural resources. We all know that China is the second largest economy in the world. And the way China is growing, it needs to possess natural resources for its growing industries and the civilian demand. And Myanmar, as a closed-door neighbor country of China, is filling this demand. I would particularly want to talk about the Shwe Gas Field, which just sits off the coast of the Rakhine state. In this picture, you can see that there is two pipelines, the gas pipeline and the oil pipeline. And Shwe Gas Field sits just off the coastal area of the Rakhine state. So this gas field is known as the biggest gas field in Myanmar, discovered in 2004. And Chinese company, the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, it is a state-owned corporation. This company has already secured purchasing rights of natural gas of this gas field, and China already established gas pipeline to import the natural gas from this pipeline to China. And this pipeline is already operational, and it's moving 12 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year. And this is the largest extractive project in Myanmar, with a potential value of $54 billion for the government a year. So what is the connection between this transactional foreign policy of China in Myanmar and the Rohingya crisis? Some local NGOs of Myanmar and other international NGOs have already documented the adverse impact of this gas field project. The Myanmar authorities and Chinese companies have been accused of land confiscation, illegal land acquisition, and forcibly displacing people from their land. So China needs the land of the Rakhine state to establish its gas field projects there and other projects related to import the natural gas and oil from the Rakhine state. So this is how China is backing Myanmar to drive out the Rohingya people who have been living in the Rakhine state for centuries. Now I'd like to talk about the second pull factor, the geopolitical importance of the Rakhine state. So the geopolitical importance of Rakhine state has already caught the attention of China. And I would like to talk about the China-Myanmar crude oil pipeline, as you can see in the picture. So this pipeline is a 771 kilometer long pipeline, which connects the Sittwe capital of Rakhine state to the Kunming capital of the Chinese Yunnan province. And this pipeline runs through the whole northern Rakhine state, and where the Rohingya people predominantly live. And China uses this oil and gas pipeline to import crude oil from Middle East and some other African countries. So China basically wants to establish this oil and gas pipeline to avoid the Strait of Malacca, which is situated in the South China Sea. And the tension between Beijing and other South China Sea made China to look for an alternative to the Strait of Malacca, and it basically found Myanmar as an alternative. The Kyaukphyu port is another thing that China has been developing in the Rakhine state. It is said to be the largest port of Myanmar, situating in the Rakhine state. And China International Trust Investment Corporation, or the Citigroup, is developing this port. So this port will be the entry port of the Shwe oil gas pipeline, as I mentioned. And this will send the oil brought from the Middle East and Africa to China. Now let's have some have a look on some list of Chinese companies in Rakhine State. I have taken this list from China Investment Global Tracker. This website basically tracks every Chinese companies around the world. So you can see that there are a number of Chinese companies who have been investing particularly in the Rakhine State of Myanmar. And it shows from the investment of China from 2008 to 2019. So I'd like to show some infographic presentation of this table. So you can see in the left graph that Chinese investment in Myanmar is highest for the energy sector. And in the pie chart, we can see that the energy sector accounts almost 58%. So what's the connection? Because we know that the energy sector basically is comprised of the oil, the natural resources such as oil and gas. And this is where China is investing. And in my concluding remark, I would say that China's global hunt for energy is basically it's trying to look for alternative resources, natural resources, and other things in some particular other areas. And Rakhine State is contributing to China's this hunt for energy to some extent. As I already mentioned, the natural resources and the geopolitical importance of the Rakhine State. So that's why China has been backing Myanmar to obtain its own national interest and political leverage. And apart from these, with the declaration of the Belt and Road Initiative, the most topical trends of international relations nowadays, Myanmar has become very crucial for China, and specifically the Rakhine State has become very crucial for China to look for alternative sea routes or land routes to import its natural resources from other countries or to gain its national interest. So I would say that China's transactional foreign policy is, to some extent, to a greater extent, actually, is responsible for this Rohingya genocide, because China is backing Myanmar to drive away these people from their land. And finally, I would say that if China wants to project itself as an influential actor in global politics, it must act responsibly and stick to its soft power projection, which it always says so. And only then it can become a norm maker rather than a norm taker in the international system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rumi. That was a really interesting presentation, and it's something I think that deserves more attention. And thank you very much for bringing it so clearly and nicely to us. The support that Myanmar is getting from China, even in the face of the atrocities against the Rohingya, because of its own interest. Thank you very much for that. That was a really lovely presentation. Thank you. If it's okay with Ondřej, I would ask for his indulgence for a moment, and of course, if it's okay with Mohammad as well, I would, because Mohammad has to leave us in a few minutes, if it's all right, I would ask Mohammad a question first. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I hope that's okay with everybody. So Mohammad, we had one question, and thank you, Ondřej. We had one question in particular that I thought was interesting for you. You had mentioned the US absence under President Obama and the loss of credibility under President Bush. And so the core of the question is, what could the US do either under a second Trump term or under a Biden administration to reestablish credibility? A very simple, short question, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Ondřej, again, and I apologize, I have to run earlier. Honestly, a second term of Trump administration, I don't think the US will do anything. And this is the problem, is losing alliances or allies and inconsistencies. And it went even more fragmented from transactional foreign policy to Twitter foreign policy on the US during the Trump administration, where there is a couple of moments where were really difficult to comprehend. For example, the US Special Envoy in Syria, Ambassador James Jeffrey, have a lecture, and like every single journalist in Washington was recording and attending, and the US plan for the Northeast in Syria after defeating ISIS. And like how we're staying there, how it's long-term sustainability and stabilization programs, defeating Iran in the region. Next morning, President Trump tweeted, "We're leaving Northeast Syria." And then I expected Ambassador Jeffrey to resign, honestly, at the time, but he didn't. But the Twitter foreign policy of the Trump administration taking us to another new level and a new world and reality and the foreign policy. But with a new administration with President Biden or any other president in the White House. I think the US could have simply basically put some weight back on pressuring specific members and allies in the Middle East, North Africa countries to refrain from intervening and funding conflicts in other places. Clearly, Libya and Yemen are clear examples. Syria is another example. That's one thing. Build coalitions more towards pressuring for negotiation and pressuring all the powers in the region to sit to negotiation table. In the case in Syria, it's another thing. The issue with the isolation with President Obama and the lack of credibility during President Bush, like everybody looked at the US as like either not credible partner or no longer interested. So we want to do our own things, and our own things ended up being funding armed groups, funding militias, funding the war, or fueling more or less the conflict. This needs to stop, and it's not going to stop without leadership. And I understand that President Obama had the strategy of leading from behind, which it didn't work even in Libya. And there's a fact that we have to face, and I understand this is not a very popular discussion when you talk about regime changes and intervention militarily in other places, but nobody is calling for that really necessarily. But usually I compare Syria to Iraq and Libya. In Iraq, you had a full regime change, like by foreign powers. In Libya, you get half intervention. We help you from far and you do your things, but the country collapses, and you get no intervention more or less in Syria to change the government, of course, intervention in the conflict. In any like totalitarian regime like this, where everything is so centralized in the hands of like few people on the top, when you remove the government, whether by foreign intervention or by internal forces, the country will collapse. And I understand the United States doesn't want to own another conflict after Iraq and Afghanistan, and doesn't want another country to rebuild. But this is going to collapse anyway. And the fact that's not our problem, it's your issue, you have to deal with it. No, it's going to be clearly globalized. And when ISIS emerged, the first thing ISIS started doing is slaughtering US citizens, journalists and activists who were there. And then kind of the US was more or less on the problem in defeating ISIS and building the coalition. So the issue is quite complicated, clearly. There's no one quick answer to this, but at least not closing the door on US presence in the region, not militarily again, diplomacy presence. And but again, if you look at the recent book of John Bolton, he's not the greatest person to quote on this or to mention on the ICC either. But the Trump administration has no leaders or heroes or champions on Syria file, and the defense secretary isn't or was all obsessed about preventing a war with Iran, which is important. Secretary of State was not really interested in leading the discussion in Syria. The special envoy on Syria is interested more to reorganize the relation with Turkey, although he doesn't have the diplomacy credentials to do that. And all these together shows you that actually the conflict could go for another 10 years if there's no international powers intervening there, or at least not intervening to stop it, at least intervening to stop fueling and financing the conflict and arming parties against each other, which is where we ended up after all these 10 years of conflict.
Thank you very much. And if you would indulge one more question that we have from our viewers. So the question is, we know that the US has removed itself from human rights and accountability issues, as you've mentioned, but what about EU members or other organizations or regional groupings? Why has nobody else stood up?
That's precisely the problem. When the US got absence, the EU was a little bit, I don't say this, but it kind of repeated what happened in the Balkans. Still, the US came to intervene with the NATO. The Europeans didn't do much really at the time, and they waited the Americans to do things. And the same with Turkey. Turkey wanted so much to intervene militarily in Syria from the beginning. Not that it would have been great or anything, but the EU didn't support Turkey because the EU didn't have the US support. The US doesn't want to be involved in the region. The US was looking at more strategic files like Iran, for example. But the Europeans didn't develop the leadership to kind of be out of the US umbrella on this. They still militarily with the US and the NATO, and the US is the biggest contributor, even militarily, not financially, like in terms of power. Take Libya, for example. In order for the NATO to operate in Libya, the United States had to take down Gaddafi's anti-aircraft missile system. And only the United States with their cruise missiles can do that militarily from the sea, like the EU couldn't do that. And then later that prompted France and other countries to lead in the NATO and do almost ground operations in Libya, which was not the mandate of them. But even if you look at that, even other entities in the or mechanisms, like take the UN itself as a whole, the UN is in trouble. Not only the EU didn't formulate power and fill the vacuum. I'll give another example about the contradictions, but it gives some context. When the Security Council was covering and reviewing what's happening in Aleppo, they passed a Security Council resolution calling for humanitarian corridors to allow the civilians leaving Aleppo, so that to avoid the bombardment by the Russian air forces. But then later the UN from Geneva called that resolution a sponsor of forced population transfer and accused the UN of sponsoring a crime against humanity. So when you see the UN in Geneva calling out the UN in New York about the mess they created in Syria, you can get an idea how complicated the issue got. And I don't blame the EU, because the rise of the right wing in Europe in general and the Russian interventions and some elections definitely caused some concerns within Europe that we cannot take refugees more, we cannot contribute to this conflict, this is going to run against us no matter what we do, and kind of altered themselves. Even in the refugee issue, when the Italian Navy stopped rescuing people and let them drown in the sea, because that's the pull factor that's bringing refugees. If you stop the pull factor, refugees are no longer coming. At least there's 800 dead bodies somewhere in Italy that's unidentified because they drowned in the sea and they were kept in Italy of Syrian refugees. So if you look at the whole picture, like, you don't want to blame one party of not doing it. Personally, because I live in the US, I became a US citizen after I came here as a refugee from Syria, skipping prison terms twice in Syria. But I blame the US because I think the US could have done a lot. But then when you meet with people here and they tell you there's no appetite for more interventions, we don't want to do it. Later you see intervention in the extremism case in ISIS. So you could have intervened for protection of civilians at large and preventing the emergence of ISIS at the first place altogether. But then you ended up intervening militarily to defeat ISIS, but not to provide any protection of civilians or to stop the conflict in Syria. That puts us to the title of this presentation, like transactional foreign policy. We'll do what works for us here, but not necessarily based on any principle.
Thank you so much, Mohammad. That was fantastic and a great wrap up before we have to unfortunately let you go. We thank you so much for being here and for
thank you very much. And I apologize to Adrian as well for stealing the time before his presentation.
No, not at all. Thank you so much, Mohammad. And with that, I would kindly ask Ondřej to be our last but not least speaker. Thank you very much. Ondřej, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. So thank you very much for invitation. I am a researcher at Czech Academy of Sciences, and I research Uyghur politics and Chinese politics. So I am not a policymaker and I'm not an international relations expert. So I will be speaking from the point of an expert in Uyghur contemporary political issues and Chinese contemporary political issues. Widely known to global audience, in recent years, there is a massive policy drive in Xinjiang going on since roughly about 2016 to comprehensively re-engineer Uyghur society, including all major aspects of life, or virtually all aspects of life. And this is a policy which has attracted considerable amount of global attention, because it comprises several issues or several measures which the global audience has long thought to be over in China, but nevertheless they have been reintroduced by Xi Jinping's leadership. These are the political re-education camps to which Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other Muslim minorities, and not only actually Muslim minorities, members of other minorities as well, be it ethnic minorities or religious minorities, or let's say political minorities, dissidents sometimes are also ending up in political re-education camps. These also include, this network of political re-education is being combined with forced labor. with the system of forced labor, which is increasingly important for the local economy, and it is tied to global supply chains, which lead from China to global economy. These also entail forced birth controls, as was evidenced in a recent very fresh research by Adrian Zenz at the Jamestown Foundation, which contributes to the growing number of data and evidence which attest towards the fact that China might be committing genocide in Xinjiang. This policy, however, also includes a lot of very strict policies which are applied to Uyghurs outside the political re-education camps network. So these are firstly regular criminal prisons. The number of sentences for so-called criminal offenses has risen dramatically in recent years. So has the repression or restrictive measures on language, on Uyghur religion, religious practice, cultural practices, social debate. Uyghur elites have been increasingly submitted to restrictive or repressive measures. Media, this all is also combined with the system of technological dictatorship, which is something that is unique and uniquely combined with the old revived measures of social and political control. As mentioned, the situation has numerous international or several links to international affairs or global politics. So one of them, as I mentioned, is the supply chains, which rely on forced labor and which involves major global brand name marks. This is a research by the Australian ASPI think tank late last year. They also affect global politics by being tied to the issue of technological dictatorship or technological, let's say, so-called cooperation of China with the global community, namely the Huawei company in question. The situation in Xinjiang also, of course, relates to the broader politics by being very much tied to the debate about values, such as human rights, civil rights. It also contributes to the discussion, as I mentioned, whether China is or is not committing a genocide and crimes against humanity in the 21st century in Xinjiang, etc. So there are a number of concerning and yet very live aspects of this situation in Xinjiang, which are pertinent to global politics. I will speak briefly about something which I researched throughout last year and this year also to a certain extent. So which is how the Uyghur factor affects Sino-Turkish relations. So this kind of follows up on the previous two presentations, and I'm happy I have heard them because what I present has a lot of adds some context to it, to both of them. So China and Turkey can be seen as somewhat comparable actors. Both in regard some similarities in their political system. They are also both strong regional players, rising powers. They have a number of common economic relations. For example, Turkey being located at the very strategic part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So there has been a number of portfolios where the two countries have been cooperating lately, or China has been managing to establish itself in Turkey. So this would be, for example, cooperation in finance. Last year, China extended its $1 billion swap to Turkey in summer. These would be also transportation networks. So, for example, the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway, which is a part of the so-called middle corridor, through which trains are already passing from China to Europe since last year. Chinese consortium also purchased Turkey's, for example, third largest container terminal at Kumport. Chinese sub-entity has bought also one of the bridges over the Bosporus and its associated motorway, for example, connecting Istanbul to its new airport. Another sphere of China's establishing itself, or China's entry into Turkey's power. Turkey's that it's building Turkey's third nuclear power plant. Also, Huawei has a research and development center in Istanbul, besides the fact that it's building Turkey's 5G network. Similarly, another Chinese technological company in question, ZTE, purchased Turkish company Netas several years ago, etc. So there is a century, let's say, approximation trend between these two countries in recent year. However, this cooperation or this centripetal dynamic gets complicated from time to time, we can say, by the Uyghur factor, namely that Turkey occasionally expresses criticism of China in very verbal terms. Such was the case last year when several Turkish leading politicians have criticized China's policies in Xinjiang in quite strong terms. For example, criticizing China at the United Nations Assembly by its foreign minister, etc. This happens quite rarely, we can say. The previous time that, as a coincidence, it was also Recep Tayyip Erdogan who expressed the criticism of China's policy was in 2009, during the last major Uyghur suppressed protests and uprising, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in the position of Istanbul mayor, I believe at that time, called China's policies genocide specifically. However, this strong verbal support is quite rare. Uyghurs comprise a sizable diaspora in Turkey. This was the case already since 1949, when large parts of Uyghur political representation eventually ended up in Turkey. Another wave of Uyghur emigres was in 1990s, after China opened its borders after 1980s and after the end of Cultural Revolution in 1970s. So wave of Uyghur immigrants into Turkey was also from 1990s on, and the last wave was after this 2009 suppressed protests, when a large number of Uyghurs fled. Recently, Turkey has seen an influx of Uyghur refugees or immigrants from various locations. So, for example, those who crossed illegally in recent years via the Southeast Asian Trail eventually tend to end up in Turkey. Also, Uyghurs who fled from Egypt and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in recent years due to various reasons, they also ended up in Turkey. So have a number of Uyghurs who joined ISIS in Syria, who after its defeat have also partially relocated to Turkey. So Turkey has a very disparate, very sizable community of Uyghur refugees. Some estimates go up to 50,000 individuals at this moment, but it's hard to count. As far as I know, there is no official statistic, and it would be methodological, I think, quite problematic. Nevertheless, the Uyghur diaspora generally has problems such as lack of documentation, which leads to further lacks of possibilities to get employment, healthcare, education in a legal way, etc. There is a serious problem of mental health issues among the Uyghur community in Turkey, due to the reasons I mentioned before, due to the situation of the whole Uyghur ethnic community in China and throughout the world as well. The Uyghur community in Turkey is also quite severely pressed by Chinese security organs, acting by social media, telephones from China or from other countries abroad besides China. Individual informants have also reported being detained sometimes for quite a long time by Turkish authorities, sometimes without an explanation. There have been also several claims of the detention being done on request of the Chinese authorities. So some informants relate this information having been sent to them while being detained by the Turkish security forces, etc. Nevertheless, they are tolerated by Turkey on the territory of Turkey, as I'm saying, in large numbers. Large numbers of individuals are stateless, without papers or without valid residence permit, etc. Uyghurs are also allowed to establish political organizations, media. They're allowed to talk to Turkish political parties and parliamentarians, etc. So they're not allowed to publish their own periodicals. So on the other hand, or from the other perspective, Turkey can be seen as a place which hosts the most sizable, relatively freely living community of Uyghurs throughout the world. During the coronavirus, of course, Turkish economy, similarly to other economies, got severely strained. Which opens other avenues for future possible cooperation between Turkish and Chinese authorities, which might presumably go at the expense of Turkey defending Uyghur interests, both domestically and internationally, which might add up to atrocities in Xinjiang not being properly investigated. For example, Turkey regularly does not join any appeals by countries at the UN level. For example, an example from several years ago, when 27 countries condemned China's actions both in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. So this statement and similar statements is not signed by Turkey, customarily. I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ondřej. That was fascinating insight into the situation between Turkey and China, and with a clear link, I think, to Rumi's presentation on the situation of Rohingya and China's role there. Thank you very much for that. So we have a couple of questions in already, and to our viewers, I would please encourage you to keep putting in some questions. We have about 20 minutes for some Q&A. And the first question is for Mariana. So you had mentioned that victims are now included in discussions in the development of new international justice mechanisms, that they are regularly mentioned. And the question is this being seen on the ground? I guess the question is, are programs in place that are actually assisting victims, or is this just all talk at the international level?
So the ICC itself has a reparations mandate. So there's a trust fund of the International Criminal Court, and the reparations proceedings are part of the kind of post-trial proceedings, if you like. So reparations have been awarded in several situations by the ICC, and programs are being implemented by them. With varying degrees of success, delay, and tensions that have then ensued as a result of the way in which the cases themselves have been framed. So they limit the reparations to the direct victims of the specific crimes that have been proven. So those can be very narrow. The first case at the ICC against Thomas Lubanga was exclusively looked at the crime of child recruitment. So this is obviously very controversial. Those children actually committed many violations themselves because they were recruited as child soldiers, but then they were the only ones to receive reparation. So of course, the communities that were affected by the conflict in which also those children participated didn't receive anything because rape, looting, indiscriminate killing, etc., were not included in the definition of the crimes for that case. So, the reparations mandate is very problematic at the ICC, but we're seeing similar reparations programs and mandates being given to other bodies. So, for instance, in Sierra Leone, quite effective reparations have been effective, it's all relative, but reparations have been delivered there. They specifically chose to focus on sexual violence victims, just to limit the number of victims and the kinds of programs. So this is something that there's been a really big increase. It's part of the whole transitional justice movement, if you like, but in new peace agreements, for instance, the peace agreement in South Sudan, a reparations authority is part of the peace agreement, whereas we wouldn't have seen that some years ago. We would have seen peace agreements that didn't include specific measures directed at reparations. So, for instance, in that peace agreement, you have a whole panoply. You have a Truth and Healing Commission, a kind of special court, and also a reparations authority. So all three mechanisms have been included, whereas previously they probably would have just included one or another. So yeah, it's something that's translating in theory on the ground, but in terms of the actual delivery of reparations, it's still very early days. There's a new body that's been established, the Global Survivors Fund, whose mandate is specifically for reparations for conflict-related sexual violence. That was set up with the Nobel Peace Prize money from Nadia Murad and Denis Mukwege. They jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize some years ago, and as a result set up this new Global Survivors Fund. So the concept of reparations is gaining real currency, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. And a question for Rumi. So you spoke about Chinese interests of the resources in the resources of Rakhine State. And the question is, how has the Myanmar state itself responded to this? Has Myanmar accepted money for these resources, and who is benefiting from China's presence there?
Thank you for the question. So as I mentioned in my presentation about the Shwe Gas Field, that China has already taken over the whole entire gas field, and Myanmar has agreed because it is very much beneficiary for Myanmar to sell the oil and gas to its immediate neighbor China. And I mentioned that by selling the natural gas from the Shwe Gas Field, Myanmar can earn $54 billion per year. So that's a huge amount of money for a country like Myanmar, because Myanmar, some of the states of Myanmar are still underdeveloped, and Rakhine State is one of them. So if Myanmar wants to develop its the underdeveloped state, it needs the money, and China is backing Myanmar in that case, I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Ondřej, so the question is, allegedly the US president expressed approval to President Xi of concentration camps for the Uyghurs. Would anything short of trade sanctions make China change its Uyghur policy, and would sanctions work in your view? Oh, you're on mute still.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think Xinjiang, the Xinjiang crisis in recent years has been one of the illustrative examples, firstly, of the failure of dialogue with China, and the failure of the presumption that China will eventually adapt to global norms after it economically liberalizes. This assumption has not come true. On the other hand, China has managed to use the global economic system to its advantage. Among other ways is financing its own authoritarian regime and its innovative mechanisms, which in Xinjiang are clearly of a totalitarian extent, because Xi Jinping's China aims to affect and redefine all aspects of Uyghur life, including internal or spiritual values. Secondly, I think it has happened several times with the Xinjiang crisis that China yielded to international pressure. For example, at first China denied the very existence of the political re-education camps, but after mounting evidence and international criticisms, it eventually, throughout the fall of 2018, admitted to the existence of these camps, even though it calls them re-education or I can't think of the word, education vocational centers. There are also cases when China reacted to campaigning, public campaigning abroad on behalf of specific intellectuals. China reacted to these campaigns and and this reaction has displayed itself in various ways. So the Xinjiang issue and how it plays into China's relations with the international community shows that pressure works. And what was mentioned here, I think it was Rumi. She was referring to the values or the principles that China allegedly professes to in its foreign policies. At the same time, I think the number of cases, and I think also the Myanmar case, and also, for example, the Sudan case study of Chinese policy, foreign policy, shows that these like verbally or normatively expressed principles in reality are not applied by Chinese diplomacy, that the foreign policy is quite pragmatic. So sanctions, I think, are a tangible issue which will be taken seriously. This is my conviction.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, is there any organization, country that you think might be inclined to actually push for sanctions? And a follow-up question that kind of relates to that has just come in was about regional actors. Is there anybody in the region, the question mentions Uzbekistan, but is there anybody in the region that has pushed back?
Well, the Uyghur issue is not specifically followed as an individual issue, but it features in agenda of various. I'm not specifically familiar in great detail with the state actors, but I'm aware of some academic actors or civil society actors of Taiwan and Japan, for example, or academia.
Great, thank you. And Mariana, a follow-up question on you were discussing the Global Survivors Fund and reparations. And the question is are the proposals on reparations limited to monetary reparations, or is there a broader view of the needs of victims, including rehabilitation, etc., or is it really focused on just some kind of monetary compensation?
Well, that's a very interesting area, because there are different types of reparations, different forms. The ICC itself has done both. So they have what they call collective reparations, which involve programming that will either provide psychosocial support, medical support, livelihood support, different kinds of educational support for those who missed their education, etc. But they've also done, in one of the cases, there also were some what they called symbolic reparations. And actually, what was sort of symbolic to us here was actually quite significant for the victims themselves. And I conducted a number of interviews about the local perceptions about the reparations. And actually, the amount of assessment and financial resources that are required to put in place the collective forms of reparation, that means that, you know, the sort of programming and to get those right and in the right locations, are actually very costly. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the amount of money spent on assessing the needs, etc. And in fact, a lot of people would have preferred simply just to have had a monetary individual reparation. And when we assessed what had happened with some of the monetary individual reparations, so there was a kind of one-off lump sum of $250 per victim. It was amazing what people had done with that. You know, they paid school fees, they themselves found what they needed. And actually, you know, I think there's a sort of fear of giving people money, which in a way is actually much more efficient, saves a lot of money, and allows the victims to really do what they, you know, with the scarce resources they have, they know what they need. So yeah, that's just on that. But different reparations programs have been implemented in very many different countries. And there are also other forms of reparation that are relevant, which are symbolic, memorials, special commemoration days, all those kinds of things which recognize and redress the balance and status of the victim within the society are also incredibly important as well. So, you know, there are all sorts of forms of reparation that are discussed, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So we're heading towards the end of our session, and I thought I would ask you all three a question that arose from our keynote session yesterday afternoon. And even though we hear a lot of the challenges that we all face at the moment and that are faced around the world, there was a note of optimism, as I mentioned at the start, from the keynote speakers about the potential for a resurgence of international cooperation. And so my very simple question to you is, what would you like to see in your areas? What are we likely to see? And what works? Who would like to take that one on first?
I'd be happy to start if that's fine.
Please, Mariana, thank you.
Yes, I found yesterday's discussion fascinating, though I was a little bit disconcerted to hear that maybe I misunderstood that the International Criminal Court was a pipe dream or a fantasy at the time, and still was. But I think we could take that up in a separate discussion. I think the optimism that revolved around current protest movements like Black Lives Matter and the kind of popular movements that are happening at the moment in the context of COVID-19 are quite promising. For me, what I think really needs to happen is that the whole human rights movement needs to become more popularized, and this might be a way of doing that. I think that one of the difficulties we've had in this period of increased nationalism and inwardness in terms of identity and the kinds of issues that have led to, you know, the election of Trump, Brexit here in the UK, where I am, and so many other examples around the world of this increase in India, for instance, increased nationalism, etc. I think that one of the difficulties has been that popular movements and increase popularism has not been met well with the human rights community. Human rights community has generally been quite elitist, and in a way, the popular movements of dissatisfaction as a result of economic crash in 2008 and the kind of globalization generally that has left many areas of the world and industries and workers behind, as you know, industries have fled to other parts of the globe as a result of globalization. I mean, all those factors that have led to this the current situation that we're seeing, where we have an increase in this transactional foreign policy as a result, which is very much kind of inward and nationalistic in a way, has not really capitalized on human rights. So in a sense, there is a strong need to popularize human rights so that actually these values that we're talking about, values in retreat here, become part of what people identify as part of the solution. At the moment, we see the popular movements being very much manipulated, and so one thing I would like to see is how we can use movements like we've seen that have been successful, like the climate change movement or the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing at the moment, to popularize actually the values that we hold so dearly.
Thank you very much, Mariana. That's an excellent point, well made. Thank you. Ondřej, Rumi, who would like to go next? Ondřej, the floor is yours.
Should I start? Okay, all right. Okay, well, first question, what would I personally like to see in my area is some kind of unified position of countries throughout the world in international organizations to some kind of value-based united position of all countries to look more into or pay greater attention and take some steps on behalf of or in the wake of China's policies in Xinjiang, but also in Hong Kong and in other domestic spheres. I think we are already seeing it to a greater degree than was customary since the assumption of power by Xi Jinping in 2012. Unlike in previous decades, I think the world community has become increasingly alert to China's domestic policies and its relation to global issues, such as I mentioned, political use of technology, such as 5G, manipulation of international institutions and its norms and values, such as China's activities in, for example, the United Nations or recently the World Health Organizations, etc. And as to what works, I think in case of China, pressure works.
Great, thank you so much for that. You see me making notes so we can feed this into the next parts of the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon. Thank you very much. And Rumi, you get the last word.
Okay, so in my area, I would like to see the global institutions should interfere in that particular area, because we all know that genocide is an international crime. So the jurisdiction should be a universal jurisdiction. And when these Rohingya people were facing this persecution in 2017, the ICC was also hesitating that whether, because Myanmar is not a part of ICC, and ICC was trying to make this argument that whether they have the jurisdiction, can have the jurisdiction over Myanmar or not. But I think if it's if genocide is an international crime, then the global institutions should take the lead, because sometimes the global actors, I mean, the state actors cannot take the lead because of diplomatic maneuver or diplomatic pressure. So I would like to see global institutions in this manner and in this area to be more proactive and to prevent genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Rumi. Thank you very much. And we've come to the end of our time. I just want to thank Mariana, Mohammad, Rumi, and Ondřej so much for your insightful and inspiring presentations. It's really been just a pleasure and a privilege to hear you. And we will try to feed in some of your excellent points into our next panel, which will start in half an hour. So I would just like to wrap up this panel by quoting Ned Temko from yesterday. He quoted himself what he had written in February in the Christian Science Monitor. And as he said, it seems even more relevant now. We're in a period of turbulence and instability unprecedented during most of our lifetimes, but we are only at the beginning of defining what comes next. I want to thank you all so much, and thank you all to our viewers for your excellent questions. And I look forward to joining everybody again at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you so much.